Before 2007, the mobile world felt like a brass and leather era of feature phones and buttoned-up enterprise devices. Nokia's Symbian handsets and Motorola's Razr dominated consumer markets, while Research in Motion's BlackBerry ruled corporate email with push services and physical QWERTY keyboards. Carriers controlled hardware, software, and distribution through subsidies and walled gardens. In the United States, AT&T and Verizon dictated handset features, data plans, and gate-kept services. Apple, still riding the 2001 iPod revolution driven by Tony Fadell and Jony Ive's industrial design, had been refining a philosophy of tight hardware-software integration, obsessive simplicity, and end-to-end control. Around 2004, a secret internal project brought engineers together under Scott Forstall, Greg Christie, and others to adapt Mac OS X for a pocket device. The effort centered on WebKit, a capacitive multi-touch interface, and a new mobile OS that would later be named iPhone OS. On January 9, 2007, at the Macworld Conference and Expo in San Francisco's Moscone Center, Steve Jobs stepped on stage not as an engineer, but as a vaudevillian storyteller. He staged a brisk, theatrical reveal that framed three devices, an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, as a single miraculous object. "Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone," he declared, a line that made the ambition and the risk undeniable. The engineering choices were deliberate. Replace physical keyboards with finger-driven multi-touch, marry custom hardware with custom software to control latency, battery life, and the overall user experience, and deliver a full Safari browser and rich media playback instead of tiny WAP pages. Those choices promised a gleaming new user paradigm, but also threatened carrier relationships, developer expectations, and enterprise loyalties, setting the stage for a collision that would reshape the industry. Apple's insistence on exclusive carrier deals, ultimately partnering in the United States with Singular, which would soon be rebranded as AT&T, magnified commercial risk and invited regulatory and competitive scrutiny worldwide. On January 9, 2007, at the Moscone Center in San Francisco, Steve Jobs staged a gilded theatrical routine that focused months of secrecy into a single crystalline announcement. This was not three devices, but one: an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, stitched together by Apple's philosophy of hardware-software unity. He moved through demonstrations like a practiced conjurer. Music played with a familiar iPod interface. A phone call was placed with a finger, and Safari loaded full desktop web pages. Each moment was designed to erase decades of handset compromise with blunt, elegant surprises. The capacitive multi-touch display responded to fingers with silky kinetic scrolling and direct manipulation, making tiny numeric keypads feel suddenly obsolete. A software keyboard rose and fell on demand. Visual voicemail removed the ritual of navigating voicemail menus, and WebKit rendered pages showed the internet as it was meant to be on a handheld device. The engineers on stage, the visible faces of a covert team led by Scott Forstall and Jony Ive, had traded removable batteries and layered carrier firmware for tight integration, bespoke silicon, careful power budgets, and a slimmed mobile OS derived from Mac OS X that aimed for buttery responsiveness rather than feature bloat. Those engineering choices read like a manifesto. Ditch QWERTY tyranny, prioritize low latency and fluid animation, and bring a full web engine into a pocketable chassis. The audience, primed by Jobs' vaudevillian cadence, gasped at each seamless trick, but the applause masked a brassy undercurrent of limitations. Subscribe. It wouldn't have fixed Edge, but it would have been fun. The original iPhone was strikingly refined yet pragmatically restrained. It lacked 3G radios and shipped with Edge data only, a deliberate engineering and business compromise that limited peak throughput. Commercially, it arrived wrapped in exclusivity. Apple partnered with Singular in the US. The carrier would soon operate under the AT&T name, meaning single carrier terms and tethered distribution. For developers, the reveal was paradoxical. There was no native SDK at launch, only an invitation to build web applications in Safari. Steve framed that stance as open, but it left third-party creators and enterprise IT teams frustrated. Those practical omissions seeded immediate controversy, network bottlenecks, carrier control, and a developer drought, turning a moment of technological triumph into a charged hinge point. That tension raced toward the retail debut on June 29, 2007. and set up an inevitable clash between Apple's aesthetic ambitions and the wider mobile ecosystem. June 29, 2007 arrived like a gilded ritual. Apple stores and AT&T outlets opened to serpentine lines in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and dozens of other cities, shoppers clutching credit cards to buy a device priced at $499 for the 4GB model and $599 for the 8GB. But those who expected instant magic ran straight into real-world friction. Activation required tethering the new iPhone to iTunes and completing an AT&T service activation. And both Apple's activation servers and AT&T's provisioning systems buckled under demand. Buyers reported error messages, long waits inside stores, and call center queues that stretched into the afternoon. Some left with unopened boxes. Once devices were live, AT&T's Edge networks built for feature phone traffic strained under a sudden burst of desktop-class web browsing. Pages that had been silky in Jobs' demos loaded sluggishly in city after city, and Apple's elegant WebKit browser ran up against radio physics and carrier backbones. Those technical limits were not mere inconveniences. They exposed the seams of Apple's strategic bargain, a beautiful, vertically integrated handset tied to a single carrier's infrastructure and policies. Developers and the hacker community reacted with a mix of admiration and impatience. Steve Jobs' early insistence that third-party software be delivered as web applications code written for mobile Safari rather than native APIs sparked a brisk flowering of web apps. Google, Facebook, and many independents optimized sites for the iPhone. Early web-based apps like webmail clients, maps, and games arrived quickly and showed what was possible with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. At the same time, a vocal demand for a native SDK grew louder on mailing lists, blogs, and at developer meetups. Independent coders wanted access to the accelerometer, Bluetooth, persistent storage, and background processes. Enterprises wanted managed deployment and security controls. Where official channels offered only a polished browser, underground channels offered unshackled freedom. Within weeks, hackers and early contributors to the iPhone hacking scene published tools to unlock SIM restrictions and run unsigned code, a process broadly called jailbreaking that bypassed Apple's controls and AT&T's lock-in. That mix of triumphant sales, embattled networks, a booming web app ecology, and an irrepressible jailbreak community crystallized the dilemma. Apple had built a marvelous instrument, but the market demanded rules, tools, and governance. Pressure mounted toward a decision point. Would Apple open native APIs, create a sanctioned distribution mechanism, or double down on tightly curated control? The answer would steer the platform's destiny and set up a confrontation that could remake the industry. The answer did not come as capitulation, but as a brass and velvet pivot. On March 6, 2008, Apple opened the iPhone SDK to registered developers, and on July 10, 2008, the App Store debuted from Cupertino as a disciplined marketplace with roughly 500 offerings. Apple's engineering and policy choices read like a manifesto of control and performance. The SDK exposed native APIs, the core location stack, accelerometer hooks, AV foundation, and OpenGLES for 2D and 3D graphics, enabling code that ran directly on ARM silicon and delivered the buttery frame rates and tactile responsiveness that JavaScript in mobile Safari could not match. At the same time, Apple enforced sandboxing and code signing. Every binary required a developer certificate and a provisioning profile, and applications were confined to a walled runtime to protect stability, battery life, and user privacy. That sandbox design sacrificed some low-level freedoms. Background multitasking and unfettered access to private APIs remained restricted until later OS revisions, but it ensured predictable performance on tightly specified hardware. Apple paired these technical rules with a commercial architecture, a curated app review process, and a 70-30 revenue split announced at launch that routed payments through iTunes and Apple's merchant systems. The combined model rewired developer incentives overnight. Indies and studios suddenly had a frictionless global distribution channel, a clear monetization path, and a quality gate that reduced noise for consumers. In return, they accepted Apple's vetting, binary signing, and a sizable platform toll. The first native triumphs proved the calculus. Sega's Super Monkey Ball, available at launch, showcased open GLES and instantaneous console-like controls. Tapilus's rhythm hit Tap Tap Revenge, and early clients from Facebook, eBay, and AOL demonstrated both entertainment and utility scaling on a handheld. These runaway successes did more than sell pixels. They validated the platform thesis. Curated distribution plus native performance created a new marketplace of attention and revenue. Developers rushed in, optimizing for the SDK, learning to thrive within the sandbox and designing around Apple's UI conventions, while App Review set norms for privacy, security, and content that would define mobile expectations. The pivot also sharpened underlying tensions. Apple's gatekeeping remedied fragmentation and carrier chaos, but concentrated market power in a single company's hands, creating a gilded bottleneck that raised the stakes for every developer and competitor. That concentration of control and the flourishing app economy it produced pushed the story toward a reckoning, a climax where technology, commerce, and policy would collide and decide who truly owned the new smartphone era. The pivot crystallized into a gilded tipping point between July 10, 2008 and the spring of 2009, when the App Store's nascent network effects turned the iPhone from a singular marvel into a dominant platform. Apple's curated marketplace, launched with roughly 500 apps and a 70-30 revenue split, gave developers a global audience and a predictable way to monetize. By April 23, 2009, Apple announced the App Store had surpassed 1 billion downloads, a blunt metric that turned promise into momentum. Breakout hits made the thesis painfully simple. Sega's Super Monkey Ball demonstrated console-caliber input on ARM silicon. Tapilus's Tap Tap Revenge became a cultural phenomenon that drove device engagement, and early clients from Facebook, eBay, and AOL moved social, commerce, and messaging habits from desktops into pockets. Those successes did more than entertain. They displaced incumbents. Navigation vendors that once sold dedicated GPS boxes watched mapping apps, and players like TomTom reframe expectations. Communications shifted as Skype and native messaging apps undercut legacy voice and SMS economics. Music services and streaming clients rewired how listeners bought and consumed audio. And camera functionality, later amplified by apps such as Instagram, began to eclipse cheap point-and-shoot cameras. The App Store's twin engines, developer incentives, and curated distribution created a virtuous cycle. More users attracted more developers, more apps increased user dependence, and that dependence raised switching costs for handset makers and carriers. Within months, the mobile ecosystem's gravity shifted toward Apple's rules. A single company centralized app discovery, enforced performance through sandboxing and code signing, and extracted economic rent through its payment rails. That concentration resolved the central tension from Act 3 by converting Apple's control into platform power, setting the stage for the broader industrial upheaval that followed. After the App Store's gilded tipping point, Apple's choices seeded a vast developer economy and reshaped product design. Opening the iPhone SDK on March 6, 2008 and launching the App Store on July 10, 2008 created a predictable global marketplace that turned hobbyists into paid developers and cemented mobile-first thinking. Designers started with touch, battery limits, and small screens rather than desktop metaphors, favoring tight interaction loops and polished animations. Business models shifted to freemium, in-app purchases, and subscriptions. Distribution centered on Apple's curated review process, code signing, and the 70-30 revenue split. Those engineering trade-offs, tight hardware-software integration, sandboxed APIs, and centralized curation, bought coherent user experiences, reliable performance, and reduced fragmentation. But they also concentrated power, sparked high-profile fights like Epic Games versus Apple, prompted regulatory scrutiny in the US and EU, and fueled privacy battles including app tracking transparency in iOS. Decades on, Apple's brass and velvet architecture still shapes competition, technical choices, and user expectations. The question remains, did those gilded gates deliver a public good or a gilded cage?